One doing any type of capturing any type of impression in the soil out in front.
I don't think I ever saw it. The thing is, when the FBI came, they moved us all away. And Mo did have the drone up, but it wasn't up constantly.
She spent her career on her knees at crime scenes. Not metaphorically, but literally on her knees, with brushes, with cameras, with specialized lighting rigs, coaxing evidence out of surfaces that looked like nothing to everyone else. Moran O'Connell was a special agent with the FBI's Evidence Response Team, one of the most elite forensic units in the country. She was not a detective. She was not a profiler. She was the person who processed the scene after the detectives cleared the tape. She was trained to see what other investigators missed. And when the drone footage from Nancy Guthrie's property was released, footage that had this entire community pausing and rewinding and screaming at their screens, Moran O'Connell did what she was trained to do. She looked at the driveway. Not the back gate, not the front door, not the windows, the flower pots, or the door frame. The driveway. And what she found, or rather what she did not find, is a question she has been asking since day one. This is day 67 of the Nancy Guthrie investigation. And if you want to understand what really happens when critical evidence might slip through the cracks of a high-profile missing person case, you need to stay with this until the end. If this kind of deep-dive forensic analysis is what brings you to true crime, do me a favor right now and hit that subscribe button for revealing untold crimes. We go beyond the headlines into the evidence that matters, and this case is exactly why that approach is so important. Brian Anton sat down with Moran O'Connell on day 67.
First thing I looked at was I was looking for tire impressions on the driveway. I only saw one set from the moment that drone went up.
If you've been following cases like this, you know that Anton has been one of the only journalists doing sustained on-the-ground reporting on the Nancy Guthrie disappearance. He has the access. He has the contacts. He has been in Tucson asking the questions that other outlets have not been asking. And on day 67, he had O'Connell. And what she said in that interview has not gotten nearly enough attention from the broader coverage of this case. Let me be clear about what O'Connell's background means because it matters for everything that follows. The Evidence Response Team, the ERT, is the FBI's dedicated forensic unit. These are the agents who are called in for the most complex, the most sensitive, the highest stakes crime scene processing in the country. The presidential events, mass casualty incidents, federal crimes where the evidence is so critical, so fragile, so contested that you cannot afford to get it wrong. Where a procedural error at the scene is not just an embarrassment, it is a case-ending failure. ERT agents go through specialized training that covers a wide spectrum of forensic disciplines: blood spatter analysis, digital forensics, latent print recovery, trace evidence collection. And within that world, tire impression analysis is not a footnote. It is a core discipline. ERT agents are trained to find, photograph, preserve, cast, and analyze tire impressions in conditions ranging from the straightforward to the deeply complicated. O'Connell was not a commentator offering an informal take to a friendly audience. See, she was a practitioner offering a professional forensic assessment to a reporter on the record by name about a real missing persons case. That distinction matters enormously, and it is the reason her observations deserve to be treated with the seriousness that they carry. Nancy Guthrie's home sits in Tucson with what is commonly called a circle driveway, a curved looping driveway at the front of the property that allows a vehicle to pull in, loop around, and exit without reversing. This is a practical feature. It is common in properties of this type in the Southwest, and most of the time it is just a driveway. But consider it for a moment from a different angle. A circle driveway is designed for convenience, but it is also, from a purely tactical standpoint, designed for a quick exit. You pull in, you do what you need to do, you leave. Tadar date, you do not back out into traffic. You do not have to reverse down a residential street where someone might see you. You do not have to make a three-point turn. You leave forward-facing at speed the moment you decide you want to leave, with full visibility forward with no awkward maneuvering to execute. If someone was planning to remove Nancy Guthrie from her home quickly, quietly, against her will in a way that minimized the time the vehicle spent in a compromised position, a circle driveway is exactly where you would want to stage that vehicle. Pull in, load, Roll forward, gone. O'Connell said as much. She told Brian Anton directly that the circle driveway at the front of the property is where she believes the vehicle that transported Nancy was positioned.
Driveway is where I think the car pulled up to get her. I know the back doors were gated, but I think something happened that caused them to go out the front. And maybe it was that dog barking in the back. Who knows?
This is not a casual opinion from someone who watched some drone footage and had a thought. This is the considered professional assessment of a career forensic investigator who has spent her life reconstructing what happened at scenes, working backward from the physical evidence to the human actions that left it. So the immediate question becomes, why the front? We know there is a back gate. We have spent significant time in coverage of this case on the back of the property, the rear access, the staging theory around the back door. Why is a trained FBI forensic agent looking at the available evidence pointing to the circle driveway at the front of the house? This is where O'Connell's theory gets operationally specific, and it involves something that at first glance sounds almost too mundane to be significant. A dog. The property adjacent to or near Nancy's home has a dog. And according to O'Connell's analysis of the situation and the evidence, that dog may have been a factor in how this abduction unfolded.
I tied it in my head to that dog of the neighbors because, you know, a squeak is a very high-pitched sound, and a high-pitched sound travels, and I'm wondering if that's what the dog heard initially.
Bark at unfamiliar people. Dogs bark at unfamiliar vehicles that do not belong. They bark at unusual sounds and smells and presences that are out of the ordinary pattern of the neighborhood. And in a quiet residential neighborhood in Tucson, at whatever hour this took place, a dog barking persistently at a vehicle parked in the rear alley of a property is exactly the kind of thing that attracts attention. It gets a curtain pulled back, it gets a porch light turned on, it gets someone stepping outside to see what the dog is reacting to. O'Connell's professional read is that something, possibly the dog, possibly another disturbance or unanticipated development at the rear of the property, caused the people involved to change their plan.
Driver came up on the circle driveway instead, and then they went out the front door. Part of the plan was to remove Nancy via the front door.
And the circle driveway, being the front of the property and open to the street, is exactly where a vehicle would leave tire impressions in the decomposed granite surface. I want to be precise here, because O'Connell was precise. This is a professional forensic assessment based on the available evidence, the drone footage she analyzed, and her extensive knowledge of how abductions are operationally planned and executed. She was not presenting this as confirmed investigative fact. She was presenting it as her reading of the situation, the most operationally coherent explanation for what the physical evidence as she understood it suggested. But she was direct enough about it that it deserves to be taken seriously. And when someone with her background points at a specific location on a property and says that is where she thinks the vehicle was, and that is worth following to its full forensic implications. Here is where this gets technically critical. And this is the part of O'Connell's analysis that has been almost entirely absent from the broader coverage of this case. The part that this audience needs to fully understand to appreciate the stakes of what she is describing. Nancy Guthrie's driveway is not concrete. It is not asphalt or pavers or any of the sealed hard surfaces you might find in a different region or a more recently built suburban development. Nancy's driveway is composed of decomposed granite. And that specific surface material, that material right there under the tires of every vehicle that comes and goes from that property, is everything for understanding the evidence problem that O'Connell is raising.
Made of decomposed granite, which is very, very difficult to develop a tire impression.
Decomposed granite, commonly called DG, is a naturally occurring material formed when granite rock weathers and breaks down over time into a loose granular aggregate. It is extraordinarily common in desert landscaping across the American Southwest. In Tucson, in Phoenix, in Scottsdale, in Albuquerque, it handles the heat. It is permeable to rainfall. It requires minimal maintenance. It looks appropriate and natural in a desert environment. Hundreds of thousands of properties in Arizona use it as a primary surface material. Forensically, though, decomposed granite presents very specific and very significant problems for evidence recovery. The core issue is this: DG is not fixed. It is a loose, shifting, granular material. It compacts under pressure, under a vehicle's tires, or under foot traffic. But that compaction is not permanent, and is easily disrupted. When a vehicle drives over decomposed granite, it does leave a tire impression. The weight of the vehicle presses down on the granules, creating a pattern that corresponds to the tire's contact surface. But that impression, unlike an impression in wet soil or mud or clay, is fragile. It can be disturbed by subsequent foot traffic. It can be shifted by another vehicle. It can be broken down by wind or by rain. And in a desert environment where wind is a regular presence and temperature cycling causes material movement, the window for recovering that impression before it degrades is not generous. There is also the issue of visual complexity. Decomposed granite has a naturally irregular heterogeneous surface texture, so it does not look like smooth mud where a tire impression stands out clearly to the naked eye. In DG, the impression exists. The compaction pattern is there, but it can be nearly invisible without the right conditions and the right equipment. Which brings us to the photographic challenge. Tire impressions in decomposed granite do not photograph the way tire impressions in mud or soil do. You cannot walk up to a driveway, point a camera at the ground in normal daylight, and capture an image that is forensically useful. The surface does not work that way under standard lighting conditions. The key technique O'Connell referenced, the technique that forensic photographers use specifically for granular surfaces and for impression evidence in challenging materials, is called oblique lighting.
Really good photographer, you can, and a great scales, sets of scales, and you move the your light source from all different kinds of oblique lightings because the oblique lighting will pick up the ridge detail on the impression.
Oblique lighting means positioning a light source at a very low angle relative to the surface you are photographing, almost parallel to it, raking across it so that the light creates shadows in any depressions or raised areas in the surface. When you do this, features that are completely invisible under normal overhead or ambient light suddenly become visible because the shadows they cast under the raking light create contrast that the camera can capture. You have probably experienced this principle in everyday life without thinking about it forensically. If you have ever tried to see footprints in a carpet by holding a flashlight parallel to the floor, not you have used oblique lighting. The footprints that were invisible in normal room light become clearly visible the moment you get that light source low and let it rake across the pile. The same principle applies to tire impressions in granular surfaces. The light at an angle creates shadows. The shadows create contrast. The contrast reveals the impression. Without oblique lighting, or an equivalent technique, tire impressions in decomposed granite are extremely difficult or impossible to photograph in a way that produces results that are forensically useful and legally defensible. You might know the impression is there. You might even be able to see it if you get on your knees and look at the surface at exactly the right angle in exactly the right ambient light. But capturing it in a photograph that can be measured, compared, and introduced as evidence is another matter entirely. And photographing the impression correctly is only the beginning. You also need scale. A calibrated ruler or measurement scale bar placed in the frame at the same plane as the impression.
Is a scale. That's what I'm talking about when I say a scale. You know, those little rulers next to a fingerprint or something like that. Well, we have the long ones for the tire impression.
A ruler is a scale. That's what O'Connell was talking about when she said a scale. Those little rulers next to a fingerprint or something like that. Well, they have the long ones for the tire impressions. This must be done before investigators themselves create new impressions on the surface they are trying to recover, before the scene is processed by anyone who does not understand that this particular surface in this particular location may contain one of the most important pieces of physical evidence in this investigation. With that is the technical framework of what O'Connell was evaluating when she watched the drone footage, and it is the standard against which she assessed what she saw and what she did not see in that footage. She watched the drone footage the way she was trained, not looking at what was dramatic or immediately visible, but looking at what was being worked. What investigative process was visible on that scene? Specifically, whether investigators were conducting the kind of careful, systematic, technique-specific evidence collection on the driveway surface that the situation warranted. And she did not see in the available drone footage evidence that anyone was working tire impressions in the circle driveway. No oblique lighting equipment visible, the kind of portable rigs ERT agents bring to scenes for exactly this purpose. No technicians on their knees at ground level with scales and cameras positioned for impression photography. No systematic grid-based documentation of the front driveway surface. No visible activity centered on the decomposed granite of the circle driveway that corresponded to the kind of impression recovery work O'Connell would expect to see on a scene with this profile. And this is where O'Connell's intellectual honesty becomes important to register. She was careful about this observation. She acknowledged explicitly that the FBI may have done that work at a time when Brian Anton's drone was not overhead.
Anyone doing any type of capturing any type of impression in the soil out in front.
I don't think I ever saw it. The thing is, when the FBI came, they moved us all away. And Mo did have the drone up, but it wasn't up constantly.
The FBI may have completed that work with all of the necessary equipment at 4 in the morning, or before the initial media presence, or during a period of scene access that is not captured in the publicly available footage. O'Connell cannot know whether that work happened from what she can see in a drone video. She was fair about that. She was precise about the limits of what the available evidence allowed her to conclude. She was careful not to overstate, but she did not see it. And that absence, the absence of visible tire impression work in the circle driveway in the footage that is available, is what has been sitting with her since day 67. An experienced ERT agent looking at a scene, looking for the forensic work that should be visible if the scene was processed as thoroughly as the situation warranted, and not seeing it, not being able to confirm it happened. That is the observation that O'Connell put on the record, and it is the foundation of the concern that follows. Let me bring in the broader context, because what O'Connell is describing is not just about photographs. It is about timing. And in forensic evidence collection on a scene like this, a high-profile scene, a scene with multiple agencies involved, a scene that was processed under public scrutiny, a scene that was released and resealed multiple times, timing is everything. We know, and this is confirmed public record, that Nancy Guthrie's property was not maintained as a continuously sealed protected crime scene from the moment of discovery through the completion of all evidence collection. The scene was released. It was accessed by multiple parties for multiple purposes. It was the center of activity in the early days of a high-profile missing persons investigation that drew significant attention and resources. Vehicles came and went from that property. Investigators moved through it. The operational reality of the early phase of this investigation meant that the property was not hermetically preserved. Think about what that means for a tire impression in decomposed granite. Every foot of traffic that crosses that driveway surface disturbs the granular material. Every vehicle that enters or exits. And in the critical early days of this investigation, there were vehicles entering and exiting that property regularly, compresses and shifts the DG. Every disturbance potentially degrades, alters, or destroys a tire impression that may have been left in that surface by the vehicle that transported Nancy. The question at the center of O'Connell's concern is this: how early in the investigation did anyone identify the circle driveway as a potential vehicle staging location? And how quickly was that specific surface, that decomposed granite circle driveway, secured and protected specifically for forensic impression recovery? If investigators identified the circle driveway as a staging location on day 1 and immediately cordoned a professional forensic opinion from a trained FBI evidence response team agent, the tire impressions, if they existed in that circle driveway, required specialized documentation techniques, and that she did not observe evidence of those techniques being employed in the available footage. That does not mean the techniques were not employed. It means she did not see them. And in the absence of confirmation that they were employed, the question remains open. And an open question about physical evidence in a missing person case is not something to dismiss or minimize or wave away. And it is something to address directly and factually with either confirmation that the work was done or acknowledgement that it was not, or explanation of why it was not possible or not necessary given the specific circumstances of this scene. Until that happens, O'Connell's observation stands as a marker of what may have been lost in the early hours of this investigation. Not through malice, but through the simple, brutal reality that forensic evidence in challenging materials is fragile and time-sensitive and requires immediate expert attention to preserve, and that, in the complexity of a major investigation, things can be missed, not because people are not trying, not because people do not care, but because the demands are enormous, and the resources are finite, and the knowledge base required to recognize every type of evidence in every type of surface is specialized in a way that not every investigator possesses. That is why the evidence response team exists. That is why the FBI has dedicated forensic units with agents like O'Connell, who spend their careers learning how to coax evidence out of surfaces that look like nothing. Because it matters. Because the difference between a case solved and a case unsolved can come down to whether someone knew to look at the driveway with oblique lighting in the first 6 hours. That is not dramatic. That is not cinematic. That is just the work. And the question at the heart of O'Connell's observation is whether that work was done here. If you found this deep dive into the forensic realities of this case valuable, if you understand now why someone with O'Connell's background is raising these questions and why they matter, then please take a second to like this video and subscribe to Revealing Untold Crimes. This is the kind of analysis that does not make headlines, but makes the difference in understanding what really happens in these investigations. There is more to come in Part 2, and you will not want to miss what else O'Connell observed in that footage that has not been addressed. This case is far from over, and the evidence, or the absence of it, is where the answers will ultimately be found. And if investigators identified the circle driveway as a staging location on day 1 and immediately cordoned off that specific area and kept it protected until the evidence response team could process it properly, there is a reasonable chance that usable impressions were preserved. But if the significance of the circle driveway was not recognized immediately, if the scene was accessed multiple times before anyone was systematically thinking about tire impression recovery in that specific location, the window may have closed quietly, without anyone realizing it in time. O'Connell did not speculate about the specific timeline. She cannot know from outside the investigation when each piece of the scene was recognized, prioritized, and processed. But she raised the concern, and it is a concern that has a precise forensic basis. Not an emotional one, not a speculative one, but a practical, technical concern about surface degradation and evidence preservation timelines. And to understand why that concern carries the weight it does, you need to understand what the FBI can actually do with a tire impression when they get a good one recovered correctly in time. The FBI maintains comprehensive tire tread databases that allow forensic examiners to compare an impression recovered from a scene to a library of known tread patterns from tire manufacturers. These databases have been built over decades and cover a substantial proportion of commercially available passenger, light truck, and commercial vehicle tires. Tire treads function in some ways analogously to fingerprints, and the Bureau has a database filled with every tire impression you can imagine, and forensic examiners can look at photographs and make a cursory determination as to whether or not tire tracks fit a particular tire. From a
database filled with every tire impression you can imagine, and we can look at those photographs and they can make a cursory determination as to whether or not those tire tracks fit that tire
model. You narrow the field of vehicles that could have made the impression because different vehicle classes and sizes use different tire categories. A tire impression that tells you the suspect vehicle was using a specific type of all-terrain truck tire tells you something meaningful about the vehicle. A tire impression that matches a specific sedan tire category tells you something else entirely. In cases where the impression is of sufficient quality and where the tire has distinctive individual characteristics like wear patterns, road hazard damage, or manufacturing irregularities, forensic examiners can sometimes narrow an identification to a specific tire rather than just a tire type. This is more rare and more contested as evidence, but it happens. Tire impression analysis is a recognized forensic discipline with a substantial body of supporting case law. It has been accepted as evidence in federal court. The FBI's forensic divisions have invested significantly in this capability, and O'Connell spent her career in the institutional context where this work is done. What this means in practical terms is a chain of inference. A clear, well-photographed, properly scaled tire impression from the circle driveway at Nancy's home could potentially tell investigators the tire model. The tire model narrows the vehicle class. The vehicle class combined with other investigative work, surveillance footage, witness accounts, audio-electronic records could produce a specific vehicle, and a specific vehicle could produce leads to the people who took Nancy. That chain, impression to tire to vehicle to person, does not start without the impression. And the impression starts on the ground, in the decomposed granite in the circle driveway, at the moment the scene was still intact enough to hold it. Becomes possible. And now I want to situate this within the broader evidence framework because O'Connell's circle driveway theory does not stand alone. It connects to something that has been covered extensively, and that connection makes both theories stronger. We have spent significant time analyzing the backdoor staging theory, the evidence suggesting that the rear of Nancy's property was deliberately manipulated, that the back door was left open in a specific way, that elements of the rear scene were arranged or disturbed in a pattern that raises questions about staging. That thread has been one of the persistent analytical focuses of this investigation from the community's perspective. Here is how the two theories fit together, not as contradictions, but as a coherent operational picture. If the back of the property was staged as deliberate misdirection designed to draw investigative attention to the rear access point to create a narrative about how Nancy left the property, then the actual vehicle that transported her may have been positioned somewhere else entirely. The staging creates the story. The real exit happens elsewhere. In that scenario, the circled driveway at the front is not a coincidence. It is the real operational point. Alternatively, and this is where the dog becomes relevant again, if the back gate was the original plan and something disrupted it, the circled driveway becomes the improvised solution. The rear exit was compromised. The vehicle moved to the front. The exit happened through the circled driveway, leaving impressions in the decomposed granite that were either recovered before the scene was disturbed or were not. Either way, staged misdirection at the back or disrupted original plan at the back, the circled driveway at the front emerges as the operationally significant location, and the evidence from that surface, if it was there and if it was recovered, is potentially central to understanding what happened. Two investigative threads that appeared to point in opposite directions are actually pointing at the same conclusion from different angles. The rear staging draws attention away from where the vehicle actually was. The circled driveway is where the vehicle actually was. And if that surface was not protected and processed for tire impressions immediately, the physical evidence that could confirm or refute this theory may be gone. If you are finding this level of forensic detail valuable, if you understand now why these technical questions about surfaces and lighting and timelines actually matter in finding Nancy Guthrie, then please take a moment to subscribe to Revealing Untold Crimes and hit that like button. This is investigative work that requires sustained attention to details that do not make headlines but make cases. There is critical information coming about DNA evidence and cell tower data that you need to hear, so stay with this. Let me be direct about what we do not know, because this analysis does not present speculation as fact, and you deserve the honest version of where the evidence ends and the inference begins. We do not know whether the FBI recovered tire impressions from the circled driveway. We do not know whether they attempted to, and if so, see at what point in the investigation timeline that work was conducted. We do not know whether impressions, if recovered, matched a known tire pattern in the FBI's database. We do not know whether the surface of the circled driveway was protected or disturbed before forensic processing, and if disturbed, to what degree. We do not know what the FBI knows. We do not have access to the investigative file. We are working from what has been put on the public record. What we do know, what is fully verifiably on the record, is this. Maureen O'Connell, a named former special agent with the FBI's Evidence Response Team, analyzed the available drone footage of Nancy Guthrie's property, and did not see in that footage evidence that tire impression work had been conducted in the circle driveway. But she identified the decomposed granite surface as a significant forensic complication for impression recovery under the conditions present at this scene. She identified the circle driveway as her leading professional assessment of where the vehicle that transported Nancy was likely staged, and she raised carefully, explicitly on the record, the concern that if that forensic work was not done in time, a potentially critical piece of vehicle identification evidence may be unrecoverable. That is not community speculation. That is not anonymous sourcing. That is a named qualified forensic practitioner making a specific substantiated professional observation to a named journalist about a real and ongoing case. It carries the weight that that pedigree implies, and it deserves to be treated accordingly. And here is something that connects O'Connell's observation to a broader pattern that has been tracked since the first days of this investigation. The FBI has been notably quiet about what they found at this scene and about the trajectory of this investigation more broadly. I want to be precise about what that means, because law enforcement's silence during an active investigation is not unusual. It is, in fact, standard practice, and for good reasons. Releasing investigative details can compromise leads, warn subjects, and undermine prosecutions. But the silence around the Nancy Guthrie case has been of a depth and consistency that has drawn direct comment from journalists, practitioners, and former investigators who are familiar with how the FBI typically manages communication on high-profile missing person cases. And it is not just that they have not released everything, it is the degree to which they have confirmed almost nothing. Brian Anton has documented over the course of his sustained reporting the difficulty of extracting meaningful investigative updates from the FBI on this case. O'Connell's observations were offered in part because the official investigative record, as communicated to the public, is so thin. She was looking at what was available because what the investigation has formally produced for public consumption has been minimal. We know the FBI has been involved. We know they processed the property at some point. We know they are presumably pursuing leads through their channels with the resources the Bureau brings to bear. What we do not know, what we cannot confirm from the public record, is what the scene yielded. What the forensic processing produced, whether the tire impression work was conducted on the circle driveway, and if so, what it told them. But silence on one front does not mean silence on all fronts, and there is a development in this case that has produced confirmed investigative movement. A black glove was found in a field near the side of a road about 2 miles from Nancy's house. The FBI confirmed that this glove appears to match the type of gloves the suspect was wearing in the doorbell camera footage. Not a forensic match of the material, but a visual match of the style. But that, combined with the fact that it contained DNA evidence, made it the most significant physical evidence recovered outside the home. Here is the timeline. The Pima County Sheriff's Department collected the glove and sent it to a private forensic lab in Florida on Thursday evening, February 12th. The glove arrived at the lab on Friday. Preliminary results came back on Saturday. Those results confirmed that the glove contains the DNA of an unknown male, someone who is not Nancy Guthrie and is not anyone close to her. The FBI then put the sample through quality control and official confirmation. Once that was complete, the profile was entered into CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System. The system searches for matches against every DNA profile in the database. If this person has ever been arrested for a qualifying offense in any state, their DNA is in CODIS. If they have ever been convicted of a felony in most states, their DNA is in CODIS. And if they have ever been required to submit a DNA sample as a condition of parole, probation, or sex offender registration, their DNA is in CODIS. The database is enormous, and it searches continuously. A match can come back in hours. But here is the critical thing everyone needs to understand. CODIS only works if the suspect's DNA is already in the system. If this person has never been arrested for a qualifying offense, their profile will not be in the database. That is the limitation, and that is where the backup plan comes in. CNN reported that investigators would likely submit the DNA to third-party genetic genealogy services.
From DNA found on a glove about 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home in Arizona. Those results could come back today. The FBI says it appears to visually match, at least, the glove worn by the suspect in the doorbell cam video from the night.
Genetic genealogy is the tool that solved the Golden State Killer case. Joseph DeAngelo evaded law enforcement for over 4 decades. He was identified in 2018 not because his DNA was in CODIS, but because a distant relative had uploaded their DNA to a public genealogy site. Investigators built a family tree, narrowed the suspects, and matched DeAngelo's DNA through surveillance. The case that was cold for 40 years was solved in 4 months once genetic genealogy entered the picture. In the Nancy Guthrie case, both tracks are running simultaneously. CODIS is searching right now. Genetic genealogy is standing by. One of these two systems is going to produce a name. But it is not a question of if, it is a question of how soon. And every person who has ever submitted a DNA sample to 23 and Me, Ancestry DNA, GED match, or Family Tree DNA just became a potential link in the chain that leads to the kidnapper's identity. This person's DNA is their fingerprint, their mugshot, and their confession all rolled into one. They left it on that glove, and now the entire forensic system of the United States is processing it. The net is tightening, and it is tightening at the speed of science. But DNA is not the only forensic tool running right now. The FBI's Cellular Analysis Survey Team, known as CAST, is one of the Bureau's most critical assets in cases like this. A retired FBI supervisory special agent told Fox News Digital that this team is likely processing mountains of cell tower data from the night of the kidnapping and beyond. Every cell phone that was active in the area around Nancy's home between midnight and 4 a.m. on February 1st was logged by the nearest cell towers. Investigators can map which phones were present, how long they stayed, and where they went afterward. If the kidnapper was carrying a cell phone, and most people are physically incapable of leaving their phone behind, CAST has already built a movement map of every device in the area that night. The retired agent said something that should make the kidnapper's blood run cold. He said authorities likely already have names that have surfaced and been evaluated. Some have been cleared. See, others may still be in play in ways we are not seeing publicly. That is the iceberg. What we see, the press conferences, the statements, the warrants, is the 10% above the waterline. Below it, the FBI is building a case with tools and data sources that the public does not even know exist. And when they surface, it will not be with a press conference. It will be with handcuffs. Cell tower analysis is not speculative technology. It is a proven investigative tool that has been used in countless federal investigations. What makes this case different is that we are watching it. This community has been watching it since the beginning, through day 1, through day 67, through every interview, every drone pass, every on-record statement from every practitioner willing to speak. And that sustained serious evidence-based attention. The fact that practitioners like Maureen O'Connell and journalists like Brian Anton are still asking these specific technical substantiated questions is sometimes how cases break open. Not through drama, not through a single dramatic revelation, but through sustained patient attention to the details that matter. That the FBI's silence on specific investigative details does not mean the investigation is stalled. It may mean the opposite. It may mean they are building something that cannot be disclosed without compromising it. The DNA from the glove is being processed through systems that have solved cases that were cold for decades. The cell tower data is being analyzed by specialists who can reconstruct timelines with precision that would have been impossible a generation ago. The physical evidence from the scene, whatever was recovered and whatever was not, is part of a larger investigative picture that we cannot see in its entirety. But we can see the edges. We can see what practitioners like O'Connell observe when they look at the available evidence. We can see what journalists like Anton document when they stay on the ground asking questions. And we can see the confirmed developments like the glove, like the DNA, like the FBI's involvement, like the use of advanced forensic tools. And from those edges, we can understand the shape of what is happening, even if we cannot see the center. The tire impression question that O'Connell raised is part of that edge. It is a specific technical concern about a specific piece of potential evidence from a specific location on the property. It is not the whole case. It is not the only evidence. It is one thread in a larger fabric. But it is a thread that matters because, if those impressions were recovered and analyzed, they could provide vehicle information that narrows the investigative field. And if they were not recovered, that represents a gap in the physical evidence picture that cannot be filled later. You cannot go back to that driveway now, weeks after the scene was released, and recover tire impressions that have been driven over, walked on, and weathered. The window closed. The question is whether it closed before or after the evidence was secured. O'Connell cannot answer that question from her position outside the investigation. The FBI has not answered it publicly, so it remains open, sitting in the record as a documented concern from a qualified practitioner who looked at what was available and did not see confirmation that the work was done. That is not an accusation. That is not a claim of investigative failure. That is an observation about what is visible in the public record and what is not. And it is an observation that has weight because of who made it and how carefully it was framed. The convergence of the backdoor staging theory and the circle driveway vehicle theory creates a coherent operational picture. Misdirection at the rear draws attention away from the actual exit point at the front. The vehicle stages in the circle driveway, where it can exit quickly without reversing. The tire impressions in the decomposed granite are the physical record of that staging. And whether that record was captured is the question that connects forensic theory to investigative reality. We are not going to know the answer to that question until the FBI chooses to disclose it, or until the case reaches a point where investigative documents become part of the public record through prosecution or other official channels. What we can do is document what is known, what is observed, what is raised by credible practitioners, and what remains unanswered. That documentation creates accountability. It creates a record that cannot be quietly revised later. It creates pressure for answers that might not otherwise come. And that matters not just for Nancy Guthrie's case, but for every case like it. For every missing person investigation where the scene is complex, and the evidence is fragile, and the window for recovery is narrow. For every family waiting for answers while investigators work quietly behind closed doors. For every community watching and wondering whether everything that could be done is being done. The questions that practitioners like O'Connell raise are not obstacles to the investigation. They are part of how investigations get better, how standards get maintained, how evidence preservation protocols get reinforced. If the circle driveway was processed correctly, and tire impressions were recovered and analyzed, and that information is being used in the investigation right now, then O'Connell's concern is answered, and the investigative record is stronger for having that confirmation. If the circle driveway was not processed for tire impressions, or if the processing happened too late to recover usable evidence, then O'Connell's concern becomes a documented example of how evidence can be lost in the complexity of a major scene response. Either way, raising the question serves a purpose beyond this single case. The DNA evidence from the glove represents a different category of investigative development. None that is confirmed physical evidence, with a clear chain of custody being processed through established systems with documented timelines and expected results windows. We know the DNA is male. We know it is unknown. We know it has been entered into CODIS. We know genetic genealogy is the backup if CODIS does not produce a match. We know both systems work and have solved cases. That is the investigative track we can follow with some confidence, because the FBI has confirmed key elements of it publicly. The cell tower data represents another confirmed track. We know CAST exists. We know it is likely being used based on statements from former FBI personnel. We know how the technology works and what it can produce. We know that phones create records, and those records can be analyzed. And what we do not know is what specific results that analysis has produced in this case. But we know the capability exists and is almost certainly being applied. These are the parallel tracks running underneath the public silence. DNA, cell data, physical evidence from the scene, witness statements, surveillance footage, digital forensics. Each track operates according to its own timeline and its own technical requirements. Some produce results quickly. Some take months. Some lead to names. Some eliminate possibilities. Some converge with other tracks. Some dead end. But collectively, they form the investigative apparatus that either will or will not bring Nancy Guthrie home and bring the people responsible to justice. The role of sustained public attention in that process is not to solve the case from the outside, and it is to maintain pressure for accountability, to document what is known and what is not, to amplify the voices of credible practitioners who are willing to speak on the record, and to ensure that this case does not quietly fade from view while investigative work continues at a pace that the public cannot see. Nancy Guthrie's family deserves that attention. Nancy herself deserves it. And every vulnerable person in every quiet neighborhood deserves to know that when something like this happens, the response will be thorough, sustained, and accountable. O'Connell's observation about the circle driveway and the tire impressions is part of that accountability. It is a specific technical question raised by someone with the credentials to raise it, directed at a specific investigative decision point. It's hard about a specific type of evidence that has a specific window for recovery. It has been put on the record. It has been documented. It has been explained in enough detail that anyone with forensic training can understand exactly what is being asked. And now it sits there, waiting for an answer, or waiting to become part of the larger post-case analysis of what worked and what did not in the investigative response to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. We will continue to follow every development in this case Every time the FBI makes a statement, every time new evidence comes to light, every time a practitioner with relevant expertise offers an on-record observation, every time the investigative picture becomes clearer or more complex, this is not a case that will be solved in a single video or a single news cycle. And it is a case that will be solved if it is solved through the accumulation of evidence analyzed through multiple forensic disciplines over a sustained period of investigative work. And we will be here documenting that process, asking the questions that need to be asked, and holding the investigative response to the standards that a case like this demands. If you believe this kind of detailed, sustained evidence-based coverage matters, if you want to stay informed about every development in the Nancy Guthrie case as it happens, then subscribe to Revealing Untold Crimes right now and make sure notifications are turned on. This is where you will find the analysis that goes beyond the headlines into the forensic realities that determine whether cases get solved. Hit that like button to help this video reach more people who care about finding Nancy and understanding what happened. And if you have been following this case from the beginning, drop a comment letting me know what questions you still have, because this community's attention is part of what keeps the pressure on for answers. This case is not over. The DNA is being processed. The cell data is being analyzed. The investigative work continues, whether we can see it or not. And somewhere in that work, in those databases, in those tower records, in whatever physical evidence was or was not recovered from that circle driveway in Tucson, are the answers that will either bring Nancy home or bring justice for what happened to her. We will be here when those answers come. And until they do, we will keep asking the questions that need to be asked and documenting the evidence that needs to be documented, because that is what Nancy Guthrie deserves. That is what her family deserves. And that is what every person watching this who cares about truth and justice and accountability deserves. Stay with us. This story is not finished.